Welcome into the Brookline.News podcast. I'm Sam Mintz, the editor of Brookline.News. We're an online, nonprofit local news outlet covering the town of Brookline. And I'm here with Jessica Smyser, who's the executive director of Brookline Interactive Group. And we're here to talk about the news.
Hi, Sam.
Hey, Jessica. How's it going?
Oh, we are hot outside in July and cool inside in the podcast room, which feels like a refrigerator. So happy to be here in this room. Hope everyone's staying cool and hydrated. Now, we're going to start off with a serious story for this week. Apparently, ICE arrested 2 people in Brookline in May and June, and this is a report that you got from Brookline PD.
Yeah, so this is a story by our reporter, Vivi Smilgas, our intern, Celeste Alcalay, and myself. And the basic outline of the story is that agents from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested 2 people in Brookline in May and June. We can go more into the details of those arrests, but basically one person was detained by ICE, which is the federal immigration enforcement agency, in late May after they were arrested by Brookline police for a traffic violation. They were then released by Brookline police and picked up by ICE. The other second arrest was in June, somewhere around the Brookline courthouse, where someone was in the custody of Norfolk County law enforcement and then were picked up by ICE. And what's interesting to me is, we've seen these really wave of arrests in other parts of Massachusetts, other parts of the country, often really publicly and dramatically made by ICE. And I think what I, as a journalist, have been wondering, and what I think many of our readers and community members have been wondering, is when that would come to Brookline. And what we learned with the story was, not necessarily in the same dramatic public way, but that, yes, ICE has been operating and active here in Brookline.
And one of the things that was interesting to me as a reader of the story was there wasn't a lot of information. I mean, a lot of the information you were able to obtain was somewhat hazy. And it seems like a lot of the measures that the town has taken to protect immigrant rights have also made it harder to understand what actually happens to people when they're arrested by ICE.
Yeah, that's true. And I think the town and the police department have a lot of policies around, giving out information about people who were the subject of ICE enforcement requests or who might have been picked up by ICE. So we, for example, have not been able to confirm the identities of the people who were arrested in Brookline. Brookline police are not sharing that, even though, in one case they arrested the person themselves. They're not saying who it was that was then taken by ICE. And ICE is not responding to our requests for information either. And the other interesting piece of that, too, is that Brookline police have made promises that they do not cooperate with ICE. That's been a very, straightforwardly stated thing. But as we reported in our story, the way that ICE even found out about this person in the first arrest was that they were, quote, connected with our fingerprint system. That's from a Brookline police official. So they noticed this person was arrested and then basically showed up. And so I think it begs questions that we have to do more reporting on that I don't have the answers to, about what is the difference between cooperating with ICE actively and about having this passive connection where, ICE is learning information from your systems.
Right. I mean, that's a really interesting question. And also the other arrest being at a courthouse, which in other communities we've seen that ICE is basically like staking out or posting up at courthouses. As we also know, it seems like this enforcement is going to be increasing. So I think it's really important for you to be doing this reporting and finding out exactly what the coordination is between local PD and ICE. So I look forward to reading more about that.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's something we plan to keep a close eye on. It's something I know many of our readers are very interested in, is again, learning about how ICE is operating in Brookline, even if it's a little quieter than in some other nearby places.
So the next story is about a synagogue that's opening in South Brookline. And this is a story that you've been reporting on for quite some time because there's been at least 2 lawsuits, I think only 2 maybe, to make sure that they were able to build this. And it looks like it's going to happen and construction starting soon. And this is despite some neighborhood concerns. So tell us more about what's happening in South Brookline.
So this is about an Orthodox Jewish congregation called the Chabad Center at Chestnut Hill. They have existed in South Brookline on Bellingham Road for a while, but they're looking to build a new synagogue, a much larger synagogue, on another part of Bellingham Road in South Brookline. Those plans, which they'd been developing over a couple of years, have been challenged by neighbors and residents of that area who say basically the building's too big, it will be 30,000 square feet, and also that, that all the traffic to and from it will be disruptive to this, what is a pretty quiet residential neighborhood. The Chabad Center has twice now come across various boards and commissions in town who have sort of sided with the neighbors. First, it was the town's Preservation Commission, which said you need to wait a year before demolishing the 2 single-family homes that you own, which they wanted to demolish to make way for the synagogue. That was overruled quickly after the Chabad Center sued and said that's a violation of our religious rights. There are very specific federal and state restrictions on how land use and zoning can restrict religious rights. That happened last year. This spring was when the second court case was happening, where this time the Zoning Board of Appeals ruled that the Chabad Center could not get a special permit because of sort of various, again, zoning regulations. And so for a second time, the Chabad Center sued. The town of Brookline did not elect to back its sort of quasi-independent commission and instead, said, we're not going to challenge this. We'll let the judge issue a special permit. So it's this really interesting collision of land use, zoning, development, religion, really a very Brookline story in a lot of ways.
And just to mention that the special permit does come with conditions. I read in the story that it has to limit its outdoor light fixtures to keep the light pollution down. It has to have a special drop-off zone for cars. So there are, even though they're getting the special permit, there are rules to mitigate it being in this residential area, which is interesting. And, just as someone who lives in the neighborhood, there's a rotary right there I drive by every day. And I'll be interested to see whether once this is constructed, the traffic patterns change or traffic changes. That rotary is already quite an adventure at Putterham. I think we all need remedial rotary training. So maybe they can have classes at the synagogue in rotaries.
Yep. And one other thing to say about those conditions is just that they range from very broad to very specific, like you said, about car drop-off, playground hours, things like that, general sort of how the building will be built and operate. And they were the subject of really weeks or months of negotiations between the town's attorneys, the Chabad Center and its attorneys, and some of these neighbors who have been challenging the project. There was a lot of behind the scenes confidential, stuff that I did not witness firsthand, but have heard a little bit about to sort of get to this point where, I wouldn't say everyone's happy necessarily, but there is sort of a begrudging truce and the project is going to go ahead. And, within the next month or so, I think they're hoping to start moving stuff around on the site.
So next we're going to meet the 91-year-old Brookline philanthropist and scientist on a quest to develop artificial blood.
This was a great in-depth profile by our intern Celeste Alcalay about a man named Andrei Dinesh. He's an Iranian Jew who first moved to the U.S. in 1956. He moved from the University of Tehran to Terre Haute, Indiana. I think a very different atmosphere there. And has eventually ended up in Brookline, where he's really built a really successful business and sort of entrepreneurial career. He's also got a reputation as a philanthropist, and that's where this latest story comes in. He's 91 years old, and he just made $1 million donation to this project to research artificial blood, which is considered sort of the holy grail of emergency medicine. Developing artificial blood, which can be used in place of, when there are blood shortages, when people aren't donating enough, when there are, for example, like crises, and they need a lot of blood quickly in a hospital. And this is a really huge donation. It's part of this sort of what's been a lifelong pursuit from him, something he worked on, in the 70s in a lab and on Beacon Street in Brookline. And he's sort of abandoned that part of his career, but now he's coming back to it, as this philanthropist. And I think it's just a really quite an interesting character.
And this is a long story, really well researched. I learned a lot. And the reporter interviewed a lot of his colleagues and people who he's helping to develop this artificial blood. And you mentioned the shortages. And one of the things I wrote down that I thought was really interesting is, blood shortages in rural areas are a persistent problem. And there's a 40% decline in blood donations over the last 20 years. I think that's everywhere. And that's really interesting and just, pushes you to think about the need for some alternative to blood donations. And the other interesting thing I thought that I wanted to bring up is he talks about Jonas Salk, who was the virologist who created the polio vaccine. And, some people listening may remember that polio was eradicated because of this vaccine. And people who, remember that Jonas Salk actually gave away the patent to the polio vaccine. He made it free so that they could develop this vaccine and send it all over the world and eradicate this really horrible disease. And he wants to follow in his footsteps and make this patent free, which is, I think, really noble and really interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, too, about, it's one thing to donate $1 million to a really well-established charity or, foundation. I think donating it to this slightly bold, slightly risky scientific research, risky only that in that it might fail, it might not develop what they're hoping to. It's just a whole other way of looking at how to spend your philanthropic money. I think that's really interesting. I just want to read this quote from him about following in the example of Jonas Salk because I think it's interesting. He says, "He just gave it free, his patent free. I'm copying him. He was Jewish, I'm Jewish. That was for humanity. That's a Jewish tradition, nothing more or less." I think that quote really helps illustrate Andrei Dinesh, and hope people will read this story.
Well, he's a fascinating person, and I really hope people will take the time to sit down and read this story because it's well written, well researched, and a really interesting Brookline resident. All right, so this last story, I have to admit, I don't know a lot about this topic, so, I'm going to be swimming into some unknown territory here. And the article is Why Matcha Mania is Taking Over Brookline Cafes. And I have never had a matcha, and I don't know if you have, Sam, but maybe you can tell us more about what the article says about matcha.
I've never had a matcha either, and that's why I assigned this story, was I wanted to learn more. That's the perks of my job. I get to have a question and just tell someone, go find out what the heck is going on for me. This is by Alexandra Sadrowski. She's a Boston University student who is working with us for a little while this summer. And she really just lays out, what is matcha? I'll answer that question in a second. And why is it so popular in Brookline? So matcha, as she writes, is the finely ground powder of specially grown and processed green tea leaves, known for its earthy, slightly bitter taste and vibrant green hue. And the green is about the only thing I know about it because you see everybody carrying them around. What she writes is that it's basically become a highly visible part of Brookline's food culture. The story focuses on a place called Maruichi Select, which is a Japanese tea house and market in Coolidge Corner. You've probably, walked by or been inside there. And Maruichi sells as many as 800 matcha drinks on a given Saturday. She talked to one shift leader at Maruichi who said that they've whisked over 10,000 matchas in their career. There's a lot of history here in this story about, it originated in China, was brought to Japan, became rooted in meditative rituals and the tea ceremony tradition. And now in Brookline is just so popular, especially with young people. There's also a new matcha place called Junbi Matcha and Tea, which is opening in Brookline Village, right on the corner of White Place. So I learned a lot from this story for sure.
800 matchas, that's just sort of landing with me. That's a lot.
Right. I'm trying to do the math of like how many hours are they open, and so how many matchas are they
How
doing
many matchas an hour? I mean, that's a lot. Yeah.
A lot.
And the other thing in the article that I learned is that it is a highly caffeinated drink. So, that's one thing that I've been trying to cut down on caffeine. But it seems like it's become sort of a rival to a coffee shop or, the local coffee shops who are selling coffee. Because matcha is, I guess, an energizing drink.
Yeah, for sure. It has a ton of caffeine. The other thing I learned from the story is that there's a million different ways to make it, different add-ons, syrups, mixes. I think that's sort of like, nobody goes to Starbucks to order a black coffee, or at least, not many people do. And I think that's part of what is the appeal of matcha, especially to these college students and younger people, is, just a million different varieties. It can be sweet, colorful, very, very playful, sort of Instagram-friendly drink for sure.
Well, I think that's an important part too, because I am on TikTok and I notice a lot of people drinking matcha on TikTok, and it is much more photogenic than a regular cup of coffee. So that could have contributed to its rise of appeal as well.
Yeah, and our story has some great photos as well, so check it out to see those bright green hues live on the page.
Yes, it is a photogenic drink. That we both have to try. So next time we come here, we're going to sit down with our matchas and give a report on what we think.
Sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam.
Thank you. And just a reminder that you can read all these stories we're talking about and more at www.Brookline.News. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which is now twice weekly, bringing you the latest stories on Mondays and Thursdays.